Hey there! Welcome back to Prog in the year 4000. Today we're going to talk about a classic of the genre that's also one of my personal favorite albums by one of my personal favorite bands. No. I'm talking about this. Selling England by the Pound from prog rock codifiers Genesis. To start off, we've got the classic lineup here. Peter Gabriel on vocals, Steve Hackett and Mike Rutherford on guitars and bass, Phil Collins on drums, and Tony Banks on keyboards.
Those sexy keyboards.
Everybody delivers fine performances here, especially when we get to hear extended solos from the criminally underrated Steve Hackett.
And Tony Banks.
I point out his guitar work in particular because he's using techniques that are pretty ahead of his time. During his solo on Dancing with the Moonlight Night, you hear him employing some pretty advanced finger tapping, which is a method that wouldn't really be a mainstream style until Eddie Van Halen popularized it on the 1978 album Van Halen 1. Now, this isn't the first time Hackett does this. You can hear tapping and even sweep picking on earlier albums like Foxtrot and Nursery Crime, and I'm sure you can find earlier examples than this. But this is a very early example of techniques that would eventually dominate metal of the 80s and even today, so you gotta give the guy credit for being a guitar pioneer. So, right off the bat, you notice something that's definitely going to affect the accessibility of this record. Most of these songs clock in at over 7 minutes, and 2 of these clock in at over 10. I personally think that the longer tunes are a great example of the band's versatility, with the previously mentioned Dancing with the Moonlight Night having some pretty stunning guitar work, while the Cinema Show, on the other hand, showcases some beautiful 12 strings, which climaxes in a keyboard solo of epic proportions from Tony Banks, who never ceases to amaze me with his melodic sense when it comes to soloing. The contrast of these two pieces really shows the cohesive writing of the band, who write pretty disparate pieces, and they still manage to make all the songs seem like they were part of the same album. The other two noteworthy pieces here are the Firth of Fifth and the Battle of Epping Forest. On a technical level, I would argue that the Firth of Fifth is probably the most well-constructed piece, where the band takes the opening piano solo and a later flute solo and explores it in not so much of a developmental way as in sort of a textural way, where they sort of run these melodies through different sounds and soundscapes, and sort of like, painting the same picture several times but using a different color palette for each one. The Battle of Epping Forest is pretty traditional prog. There's lots of changing meters, there's lots of opposing sections, but the lyrical content is actually a pretty graphic description of a gang turf war. I consider this to be a really underrated Genesis tune. The musical elements here are just as technically superior as any of their more well-known tunes, but this is probably due to the relative obscurity of this song in their live sets, since it was dropped after the initial tour in support of Selling England by the Pound, considered by the band to be too difficult to play live. Yep, that's right. Battle of Epping Forest was too prog for these guys. After the Ordeal, an instrumental piece by Steve Hackett is really just okay, and in all honesty, your memory of this song is probably going to be eclipsed by the more dynamic sections of Moonlight Night, Cinema Show, or Firth of Fifth. But what this album might be most remembered for is the group's first attempt at a commercial single, I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe. The single was a lukewarm success, but it's an important milestone for Genesis, marking their first real foray into pop success that would eventually culminate in financial success by the mid-80s. In addition to being an interesting historical document, this song is catchy as all hell. While you not be impressed with your first listen, don't be surprised if you find yourself humming along with this a week later. This brings me to another hidden gem on this album, More Fool Me, which is a sweet little ballad sung by Phil Collins, the only other instrumentation being Steve Hackett's acoustic guitar. This is a really excellent love song about a guy whose lover walks out on him, and it's definitely going to tug the heartstrings of anyone who's had a relationship gone sour. Now, this isn't the first time Phil got a solo spot on a Genesis album, but it's just interesting because it's, one of the first hints of his eventual solo direction. There's also an interesting bit of foreshadowing since Collins would eventually take over as lead singer after Peter Gabriel's departure, to many mixed reactions, but that's a whole nother episode. So, where does Selling England fit in on the sliding scale? Well, though I consider this album to be a fine piece of craftsmanship, I'm also a musician who's been trained to notice little details like Rutherford and Collins' excellent rhythm section, and Steve Hackett's guitar technique, and Tony Banks' really excellent harmonic sequences.
Tony.
So, while the extended songs aren't the most complicated things that I've personally ever heard, I think that most folks are going to miss the fine print and all the little things the first time around, and I don't think that'll generate enough interest for them for a second listen. However, the two shorter pieces are perfectly suited for the less prog inclined, and I definitely recommend I Know What I Like to the Dark Side of the Moon crowd, and More Fool Me for anyone who enjoys a sort of lighter 70s pop sort of thing, a la Simon and Garfunkel or maybe some of Tim Buckley's lighter stuff. I think these songs are a good jumping off point for anyone who's not really familiar with Genesis' prog period but might be kind of intimidated by the seemingly intellectual veneer. Because of the pop pieces, I'm tempted to place this lower on the scale, but I should note one thing about the lyrical content. A lot of it is various allusions to then contemporary English society, Dancing with the Moonlight Knight in particular. In fact, the final track, Isle of Plenty, which rather appropriately here reprises Dancing with the Moonlight Knight, drops several punny references to English supermarket chains. And that's probably going to go over the head of a lot of American listeners, myself included, until I started doing a little bit of research for this episode. So the lyrics are going to come off as pretty bizarre and nonsensical to a lot of people. And that may be a turnoff to some, but I think the band is definitely going for something dreamlike and surreal here. Just take a good look at the cover again. I mean, we have a guy sleeping while a whole bunch of strangely colored people seem to be lining up for almost a dance in the background. And intentionally or not, I think the seemingly odd lyrics do a really good job of portraying something that's just out of reach, like dream logic, like the thoughts that you have while you're unconscious. Alright, bottom line, though this is definitely not the group's most ambitious effort, the extended numbers are going to keep listeners away. You might hear I Know What I Like on some weirder radio, but don't expect to hear much else from here, although some of the longer stuff does tend to pop up on XM radio stations that are dedicated to this sort of thing. This album is definitely prog, but the singles here are what's going to keep this from going too far up the scale. Selling England by the Pound is going to go right in the middle of our sliding scale, a must-listen for all dedicated proggers, but not recommended for newcomers to the genre. That's all for today. I'm Sean, and thanks for tuning in to Prog in the Year 4000.